Hey you guys, Tomes of Terror time. We're doing another book review. So this is an author that I have covered before. I think a while back, probably last year, a few months ago or something like that. I reviewed a book called No One Gets Out Alive, which was actually made into a movie for Netflix, which I still haven't seen yet. God damn it. I really need to get around to doing that because I really did like that book. I think I first saw it recommended on the Jordaline Reads YouTube page. I really like her, and her recommendations are usually really good. And she really dug that book, and I ended up really liking it myself. And then I noticed that recently this book that had come out, which is called Cunning Folk, also by Adam Nevill, now billed as Adam LG Nevill, which I don't think it was on the other book. I have to check. I have it over there someplace. But I saw this one turned up on my Kindle Unlimited for free. So I said, what the hell? I really liked his other books, so let's check this one out. And also, I was really tempted by it because it's folk horror, and I tend to really like those kind of books. And I will say that I think as much as I loved No One Gets Out Alive, I think I liked this one a little bit better, just because I don't know. I think the story was a lot more contained and a lot more intimate, and a lot of the imagery was a lot more horrific. And I really, like I said, I really like folk horror elements in stories. There's not really a lot, there's not as much of that maybe as there are some other kind of like ghost stories and things like that. So I really did like this sort of kind of original take on it. Now, this book actually is fairly recent, just came out in mid-September 2021, I believe. But yeah, so if you have Kindle Unlimited, you can read this one for free. And it is definitely worth reading if you're into folk horror and if you're into the subgenre, which Adam Nevill actually wrote kind of an afterword for this book, which is actually pretty interesting. And he's saying that this is a neighbor horror. He's like, well, you don't really read much about that. And he was kind of going and maybe extrapolating as to why that was or why there wasn't any. But yeah, this is actually kind of like a neighbor horror as well as a folk horror. He also said another interesting thing in the afterword that he wrote was that this book actually started out as a screenplay, and that he had ended up writing a whole bunch of different versions of this as a screenplay. And because it still hasn't gone into production, he decided, well, fuck it, I'm just going to turn it into a novel. And then that way, if it eventually gets made into a movie, cool. If it doesn't, then at least, the story didn't go to waste. Because, he said it's weird because even though he wrote a whole bunch of different treatments of this story as a screenplay, he's like, it still took him more than a year and like 7 or 8 different drafts, like for it to go into a novel. He's like, because you would think that it would be easier, like that because you already had everything outlined out and stuff, but it's totally not, because it's like a completely different format. And I can see where he's going with that. Because I was kind of thinking the same thing. I'm like, I wonder if it would be easier, because I've never really done that before. I've written like original screenplays and original stories, but I've never tried to do one into the other. So I don't know how easy that would be. Apparently not very easy, at least according to him. So what do we have in this book? Now, Adam Nevill is a British writer, and mostly grew up in England and I believe in New Zealand also. So this book is set in rural England, in sort of like an unspecified village. He said it's in the southwest of England somewhere, but he doesn't really go any farther than that. It's mostly just based around 2 houses, 2 kind of farmhouses that are right next to each other. And like I said, it's kind of like a neighbor horror. It doesn't really go farther afield than that. There's really only one other house or one other character that kind of plays into it to any great degree. So as I said, this is a very contained story, just basically being around these 2 houses. What you have at the beginning, though, is there's like a little bit of a prologue, rather, where a guy who is working on this, sort of falling apart rural farmhouse, and he suddenly feels compelled to essentially hang himself. You kind of have the feeling that he's fixed up like a few rooms of this house, and like he doesn't want to do this, but it's almost kind of like he can't stop himself. So at this point, you're kind of wondering, like, is the house making him do it or something like that? Because it's left kind of like very vague. So this guy actually commits suicide in there. Although, like I said, he seems like he wasn't really a willing suicide. It was kind of like the house or something else was forcing him to. So we jump ahead 6 months. And there's this young family. The dad, Tom, who is a graphic designer, but has been out of work. He's been freelancing, but has recently lost a lot of his clients or has lost his job. He has a wife named Fiona who works in a bank, and they have a 4-year-old daughter named Gracie. Now, they had lived in the city, whatever city it was, in kind of this cramped, like, 2-bedroom apartment. And Tom has got it into his head that he's like, well, I want my little girl to grow up in nature, like, so she can run around in the yard and, just have like a more natural upbringing instead of being like crammed into this little bitty apartment with her parents. And so he just wants something better for his family. He wants this kind of like rural life. So it seems from the implication at the beginning that he has kind of picked out this house. I don't think that Fiona, his wife, was kind of like averse to it necessarily, but I think she's a little more ambivalent about the whole situation. And she's just kind of going along with it. She's like, yeah, that might be like a nice dream and everything. I think she has gone to see the house, but maybe didn't look at it as much as maybe they should have. So they get this house, which it will be no surprise to anyone that this is the same house that the guy committed suicide in earlier. Now, they do know about this, so they're kind of saying, hey, we got 20,000 pounds like knocked off the price, so we can't complain about it too much, but it's still kind of in rough shape. And then when they show up, like after they've actually purchased it, it seems to be in like rougher shape than they remembered when they were like actually looking at it or getting the inspections or whatever. And when they first go in the house, Tom finds that he's really still kind of creeped out by the fact that that guy hung himself in there and he can't really stop thinking about it. One weird thing, though, there's a lot of weird things. Like I said, the house seems like in shittier shape. The yard looks real ratty, which, like I said, that's not surprising since no one's lived there for a long time. They said the last person that lived there obviously killed themselves. They didn't get a lot of work done on it. And prior to that, no one had really stayed all that long. You're thinking this is going in sort of a haunted house direction, but that's not exactly what this story is, which, like I said, I think it was cool because it was like a little bit of an original take. They do notice there's this caravan, or as we would say in the United States, kind of like a little trailer or something, like a little RV type situation. And it's kind of like this little ratty thing, and it's sort of like parked in their driveway or across their driveway, and they're kind of like, okay. Now, they only have one house that's next door to them, their neighbors. And weirdly, even though their house kind of looks all ratty and fucked up and abandoned, the house next door is like this beautiful, like fairy tale looking, like everything is immaculate. And especially like the house looks awesome, but also the gardens are awesome. It's like these fabulous, like lush gardens and all these beautiful, like brightly colored flowers. And it just looks perfect. So like the lawn like looks like a golf course, and it just looks like unbelievably amazing, just like out of a fairy story. So they're just kind of like, and they're like, well, the contrast between the way that property looks and the way their property looks is obviously making their property look a lot worse by a comparison. So Tom is just kind of like, when he's like, okay, well, I know this looks bad right now, and I know that we just put the down payment on the house and now we have a mortgage and then I lost my job. But he's trying to kind of like rally his family to the point where, he's like, well, we have some savings, and it's like, I won't be working, so I'll have all this time to fix the house up, and it's going to be our forever home, and it's going to be awesome, and our daughter Gracie, and also they have a little dog named Archie that they bought for their daughter. They're like, it's going to be like the perfect family. It's going to be rural. She's going to play in the woods, and the dog's going to run around, and it's going to be like a dream come true. So he says, I'm going to start working on it immediately, like right away. Problem being, though, that the people that live in this picture-perfect house next door, I'd never really got a sense of how close together these houses were, because it did seem like there was a garden between them. But a couple of scenes, too, it almost kind of sounded like they shared a wall. I don't think they shared a wall. Like, I don't think they were detached. This is England, and I know that they have detached and semi-detached and all that other kind of stuff. But I never got the feeling that these houses were attached to one another. I thought they were separate. But there were a couple of scenes in there where I kind of questioned that for a second, because he seemed to say, like, oh, he was banging on the wall, and the other people were banging on the wall. And I'm like, well, if there was a yard between you wouldn't really hear that. But I don't know. It was, like, a little bit confusing. But anyway. So I'm not sure how far away this other house is, because it seemed like there was a fence and like a line of trees, because that kind of factors into the plot later on. So the people that live next door are the Moots. That's their last name, is Moot. They actually don't find out what the names are until later, but it's like an old guy whose name is Magi Moot. And the woman's name, which you actually don't find out until much later in the book, is actually Medea. Now, at first, you think these two are husband and wife. They're very, very old, and they're very, very weird and very, very eccentric. It's very funny, like the descriptions of them, they just look like these ridiculous... They just look ridiculous. They're like, the old guy has kind of like the white hair, but it's like a clown. I kind of pictured him looking sort of like Goofy Riffraff or something like that. And they said he's always wearing these ridiculous things, like these bright yellow pants and all this other kind of stuff, like trousers, not pants, because I know in the UK, like, pants are underwear. I get it, you know. Trousers, yellow trousers. So he's wearing those. And then, like, the little woman, who's like this tiny little thin woman, has this like really weird like bowl cut hair that's red. And he's just talking about like how clownish they look. They're also super really, really rude and like really, really condescending. And basically they seem to... They have no compunction about like really making the family that just moved in next door feel very, very unwelcome. Basically, without really coming out and saying it, at least at first, the Moots are basically like, we don't want you here. Like, every kind of thing that they do and say, like, it, you know, exudes that attitude. So these two horrible people, which are next door, like I said, they make these condescending, like, passive-aggressive kind of statements and shit like that. And, you know, at first the family are just kind of like trying to be friendly, but then they're like, okay, whatever, you weird old people. It's like, maybe they'll be dead soon, but you know what I'm saying? So they're trying like not to worry too much about it. Like I said, they're having some money problems because the husband's lost his job, but Fiona still has her job. So she basically has a week off, you know, while they move, and then she has to go back to work and take the little girl to school. And Tom is left in the house by himself. And he's kind of left with this big task of trying to fix the place up, you know, with their dwindling finances. And he's really trying to make this, like I said, a perfect home for his burgeoning little family. But as you might imagine, this is a horror novel. And the shit with the neighbors, the Moots, starts to escalate precipitously. There's kind of a thing where Gracie, the little girl, she wants to kind of go play in the woods behind the house, and she finds kind of like this magical looking clearing, and like there's all this cool shit back there, like a mound, and then like the dog starts digging up like these weird little tiles that have like these kind of strange symbols on them and shit like that. And it turns out too that the Moots do not want any of them going into the woods, even though they don't own the woods. Like, it's not part of their property. It's actually kind of public property because it's like right behind both of their back gates. So there's that. And then it starts to kind of escalate even more when the neighbors, the Moots, like actually start doing things that are probably them, like knocking the fence over because they're saying, oh, well, it's like an old fence and you need to tear that out because it looks shitty. And Tom's like, well, yeah, that's not super high priority right now. I still have to like fix the inside of the house. I've only just finished my daughter's room and now I have to do the bedroom and I have to do all this other stuff. But they're like, yeah, well, you need to get on that. And then it mysteriously falls over, you know, in a way that made it seem like it could have been an accident because it was kind of like in bad condition. And then like other like worse things start happening that again are probably them, but they still have like plausible deniability about it, even though they seem they're just these horrible people that seem like they almost kind of like come out and gloat about it too. But the frustrating thing is that Tom, the husband, he's kind of home by himself working on the house all day, so he's the one that's dealing with these fucknuts like next door. And so his wife doesn't really see it. The daughter doesn't really see it. Now, the daughter has been having some weird, like, she's having some weird dreams. And when she goes back in the woods, she thinks she hears, like, a woman calling to her, which actually does kind of come into play later on. But, you know, that can be explained away because that's just a kid or whatever. But Tom is becoming convinced that the Moots next door are specifically have it out for them and are kind of, like, doing things to ruin their whole family. And it gets kind of, you know, as I said, it's folk horror, so it does get kind of like magical as the time goes on, like black magic type situation. But of course, Tom is kind of the only one that sees this, and Fiona doesn't really believe him. She just thinks that the neighbors are assholes and that he should just ignore them. And he can't really do that because he starts to become more and more convinced that his family is actually in danger from them and that they're going to do some really fucked up shit. And that maybe, it takes him a while to get to this point, but that maybe they're using like some supernatural means to get them to leave or to like just do some really fucked up shit to his family. But again, like, no one really believes him, and it gets to a point where he maybe starts to not believe himself. Like, maybe he's just being paranoid, maybe he's just having like a run of bad luck and it's not them at all. And so there's that kind of like tension going on with it as well. So yeah, it just mounts up and mounts up, and this was one of those books that I kind of feel like his other one, like No One Gets Out Alive, was like this too. But it's just one of those horror novels that you just like read it and it starts out kind of like, oh, yeah, that's fucked up. And then, oh man, that's really fucked up. And it's like, oh shit, that is like super fucked up. And then it's just like getting worse and worse and worse. And it's just kind of like, it gets to a point too where you're just kind of like, I don't know, it's like, how are they going to fix this kind of thing? Because it's just getting so bad and it's just getting so catastrophic that you're just like really not sure how it's going to resolve. And it does. And actually, I really liked the way that this ended. I liked the resolution of it because I really didn't know how, like I said, I didn't know how it was going to get fixed, because it just, by the time that it got to the end, it was just so bad and so like out of his control that I wasn't really sure how it was going to go. But I really did like how it went. One criticism I did see, but I don't necessarily have this, but I see where people are coming from. The main criticism I saw of this, which was fairly minor, like most people seem to really, really like this, and I really liked it as well. But the first part of the book is very, very descriptive and very like densely descriptive. I mean, not to a point where it's just like a slog or anything, but it does go a lot into kind of describing what this setting looks like these two houses, what the Moot's beautiful fairy tale lawn looks like all the flowers and stuff, and like what Tom and Fiona's property looks like, when it's kind of like, kind of broken down or whatever, and then kind of like describing things in the woods. So there is a lot of like really, beautiful, like descriptive language, but I think some people thought that was like a little bit too much to get through. Like I said, I didn't really feel that, but I see where they're coming from, because there were some kind of passages that I had to read them a couple times, because while they're beautifully written and while they're very evocative, sometimes you really kind of have to read them again, like to get the full impact of like what he's saying or what he's describing. So there is that. But once it gets to kind of a tipping point, because like I said, up to one point, it's just like these neighbors are just assholes, right? And then it's just like little shit. Like I said, like, oh, did they knock the fence over? Did they do this, that, the other? You know what I mean? Did they park the caravan at the end of the driveway? And then there's like, then people will show up at their house and there's like all kind of weird shit going on. Like people be like kissing their hands and all this other stuff. So, and Tom's watching being like, what the fuck? Like, who are these people? So there's that, but it's just like little things at first, and then just it gets worse and worse and worse and worse until it's just like fucking crazy out there. And so it really gets to a point where, toward the end, it gets like really gruesome and grisly and just kind of like way the fuck elder gods type situation, you know what I mean? So that kind of stuff is very kind of evocative and descriptive as well, because there's scenes of it where the magic, the folk magic stuff kind of takes hold, where it's almost like, I don't want to say Lovecraftian, but it's kind of like, interdimensional type of stuff, or like I said, some of these old gods in the earth and all that kind of stuff. So there is that aspect to it as well. Overall, this really, I don't know, this one really kind of like got under my skin, I think. I really do like folk horror, and the way that this was written, like the way I could just kind of like see it in my head and almost like a fairy tale. And like I said, maybe it's just because it started as a screenplay, and now I'm dying to see this as a movie. I hope they make it into a movie one day. Maybe they will, because they did make No One Gets Out Alive, I think, like a couple years ago. Was it a couple years ago? It wasn't that long ago. But they made it into a movie for Netflix. So I would actually really like to see this as a movie, because I think this would, visually, just the descriptions of the woods and the descriptions of the properties and stuff like that would visually make a great story. And then, like, just as it gets more and more horrific, there was all kind of like gruesome, like, graphic shit that happens like toward the end, and kind of fucked up shit that happens to, you know, some innocent characters that's pretty terrible. So there's that as well. But yeah, I really got into this, and like I said, as good as No One Gets Out Alive is, I think I actually liked this one a bit better, because I did like the folk horror aspect, and I did like the neighbors from hell aspect, which, like I said, they don't, he kind of went into this a little bit in his afterword, where he was saying, he's like, I don't know why there's not more horror stories about terrible neighbors. He's like, because of all the places I've lived, and he like kind of went on this litany of like all these horrible neighbors that he'd had, and he's like, and you don't really think about it like when you move into a place, like what the neighbors are like, but it's like those people are gonna affect your life like to a very large degree, and it's something that's almost kind of like an afterthought, and he's like, maybe it shouldn't be. And so he's like, so I was wondering why there wasn't that much horror about, you know, horrible neighbors, like, or in this case, like really fucking satanic fucking neighbors. I mean, just they're the fucking worst. It's just unimaginably bad, like what these two old folks get up to. But yeah, so definitely, if you have Kindle Unlimited and you like folk horror, and you like stuff that's really like gorgeous and descriptive, and I mean, his writing style is just really it's really beautiful. It's just very literary and very poetic a little bit in a way, especially the way he describes various things, describes the setting. But yeah, it's just, I had a really good time with this. It's really fucked up, and it was one of those ones too where I don't know if this is just because I'm getting soft-hearted in my old age or something like that, but sometimes like you knew something bad was gonna happen, and it's just like I just kind of felt like my stomach like clenching like that, going, oh shit, I know where this is going, and I don't know if I want to keep reading it or not. But that's good though. I mean, that means that he did his job, because it's a horror novel, and yeah, it's pretty horrific. So yeah, if you have Kindle Unlimited, definitely check it out. It's really good. And yeah, I'll definitely be doing more Adam Nevill. He also wrote one called The Reddening, which a lot of people like, and he wrote one called The Ritual. So I'll probably be getting around to those eventually as well. But yeah, so this one's called Cunning Folk. So check it out. And if you have read it, let me know what you think about it in the comments. And that will do it for this Tomes of Terror. I will see you guys on the next one. Bye.